Hi everyone, welcome to week 8 and today we'll talk about some important stuff about regimes, democratic regimes and non-democratic regimes. So today we'll cover 5 things, basically the 5 components of democracy is going to be the first thing, and then we'll talk about implications of those components. And then we'll talk about non-democracies and authoritarian systems, their main characteristics. And then we'll talk a little about modern authoritarianism, what does it mean, and how new authoritarian systems differ from other older authoritarian systems. And finally, we'll talk about the crisis of Western democracy. So overall, when we talk about democratic systems or regimes, we are talking about 5 components, and they are actually participation and pluralism. So we talked about those last week a little bit. So those two are very important components. I will give you a brief definition of those. But other 3 are the things that we did not talk about last week. So the third one is developmentalism. The fourth one is protectionism, and then the performance. So participation is quite easy to understand, right? Selecting government officials is one of the most obvious ways in which people can be connected to their government, because connection is very important in democratic systems. So basically we are talking about, of course, all eligible citizens are free to vote, campaign, debate, and those are very important components of participation, political participation in democratic system. Second, pluralism, which is very connected with the participation aspect, and the multiplicity, the diversity or plurality of opinions and groups free to express themselves, whatever their ideology is. It can be a communist ideology, and of course we can always discuss about fascism as an ideology, whether it should be permitted or kind of seen as a legit way of describing ideas or not. We can always discuss about those, especially tomorrow when we have the synchronous meeting. But basically democracy requires that all the people with all their differing ideologies, opinions and values, so forth, be free to connect to government. So no one should be excluded from the system. So these 2 components are very important, but there are also 3 other components that probably we should talk about, which is the third one is developmentalism. Developmentalism means the extent to which the people develop their human potential sufficiently to possess an awareness of their actions as part of the democratic process. So this is quite important, because in this one I think we are referring to civil society. So basically voting in every 2 years or 4 years is not necessarily enough for a healthy democracy to flourish. So the citizens, different groups, different interest groups, we can say, and non-governmental organizations, right? So they also need to actively involve in politics, so that there will be self-awareness or a consciousness of the need for self-governance. So this is a very important aspect of any given democracy, which is quite absent in today's Western democracies, one of the crises that we'll refer at the very end of this short session. So the fourth one is the protection. So protection from what? Protection from the danger of the tyranny of the majority or the democratic institutions itself. So basically the governmental power may be strained through constitutional protections of freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of association, freedom of religion. Here we are talking about, of course, the US Constitution, right, and Bill of Rights, and then through checks and balances, right. All different 3 branches of governments in the United States, for instance, are independent from each other, and they apply checks and balances on each other. And those kind of things protects against the possibility of one branch of government becoming all powerful, right? So this is quite, some people are actually having the anxiety that the current president, Donald Trump, is moving towards that kind of a very dangerous spectrum, where actually he makes it very clear that he might not necessarily accept the electoral results, because he already said that he is quite suspicious about having some fraud, especially mailing the votes. So we'll definitely talk about those in tomorrow's session as well. The fifth one is the performance. So performance is probably the most important one, especially when we refer to the crises of the democracy. So if a government is democratic, then it is reflecting and serving the demos. Demos is the people, the citizens, right? Then the demos should be living as well as possibly given the resources available within the territory of the state. So I think the best way to measure this in today's world is the quality of life of the people. So if the quality of life of the people is not necessarily high enough, then it is very difficult to talk about a well-performing democracy. So what are the implications? The first implication, I think, is any discussion of democracy is almost non-objective. We are talking about a very subjective discussion of any kind of democracy here. So most of things are actually quite subjective from which perspective you are going to look at it. We can always refer to things like the Sedition Act, the Richard Nixon administration and their harassment of the anti-war protests during the Vietnam War. We can definitely refer to the Patriot Act. So those things actually happen in the so-called most democratic system in the world, which is in the United States. But even your system is very democratic, those are the instances where you see actually the government couldn't be stopped to violate basic human rights. So another important thing is various components of democracy may not coexist harmoniously. I think this is very important. So in this one, I want to refer to two important components of democracy that can be in conflict. The protective democracy versus performative or performance perspective. So in the protective one, let's think about, for instance, the energy policy, right? In terms of the energy policy, the United States, before Donald Trump administration, signed some important international treaties or agreements that actually the US policy kind of revolves around higher industry efficiency standards and voluntary participation in clean air projects. So basically, we are talking about here global warming and the carbon dioxide emissions. And what voluntary participation means is the U.S. governments, especially under Ronald Reagan and then Father Bush administration, they kind of made this agreement that the industrial sectors are voluntarily participate in these clean air projects. So basically here what I'm trying to say is from the protective perspective, the government is not necessarily that much inclusive or regulating agency here. This makes actually US more democratic compared to other European systems because of the smaller role of the government. But let's talk about European countries. Let's talk about, for instance, the Netherlands. So Netherlands is taking a different approach. The policy in the Netherlands is extracting resources from the citizenry and attempting to modify citizen choices by shifting choices away from the gasoline consumption, because they apply very heavy taxation on the automobiles and the gasoline. So from that perspective, the Netherlands is less democratic from the protective democracy perspective. But from the performance perspective, it is just the opposite, right? Because we can always make the argument that the quality of life for the people living in the Netherlands improved beyond that of the United States. So I think this is quite important, and we can definitely talk more about this tomorrow during we discuss. Another one is democracy involves more than government. So civil society is a very important characteristic of any given political system. Civil society is part of the country's life that is neither the government nor the economy, but kind of a domain in between, with interest groups, political parties, individuals interact politically oriented ways. So this is quite important, especially if civil society is alive, with active groups offering multiple opportunities for political debate or association or interaction. Then I think there is this argument that it will reflect to the government. So the government will be more democratic in those systems. And finally, the forms of democracies are very diverse. We are talking about so many different institutional arrangements. For instance, some democratic systems do not have judicial review. Some democratic systems, like for example the UK, does not even have written constitutions. Some systems, especially most of the continental European systems, are parliamentary systems, which means that there is no separation of power. So basically, the legislature and the executive are one. So we can also talk about this in the next weeks when we talk about the branches. So let's talk a little about non-democratic and authoritarian regimes. So first of all, what differentiates non-democracies from democracies? Non-democratic governments may be anti-participatory. So basically, if people are mobilized by government to participate in actions coerced by the government, then the coercion precludes the free participation in any given system. I think the best example can be the removal of the Salvador Allende in 1973 by the military coup, and the Augusto Pinochet came to power with the help of the United States at that time. The CIA got involved in that. And then after Pinochet came to power, he brought a huge limitation on the participation in Chile at that time. Non-democratic governments may contain themselves in part by suppressing certain groups. So this is not necessarily about participation, but by certain groups, we can definitely talk about students, university students, journalists, opposition parties, etc. So this kind of violates 4, maybe even the 5 components of democracy: participation, protective government, pluralistic government, and developmental democracy. And in non-democratic governments, government's output may de-link the government and the people. So, there can be quite different versions of authoritarian systems, like military, party, family, and individual elites can be in power. And finally, rules governing political succession in non-democratic regimes have often been unclear. So I think the best example you can think of is what happens after Vladimir Putin in Russia or Recep Tayyip Erdogan in Turkey die or lose power. Nobody knows who is going to succeed those authoritarian leaders. So I wish I had time to talk about modern authoritarianism, but I have to skip, and maybe we'll talk about those tomorrow during our discussion. But let's talk a little about the crisis of Western democracies. So I think we can definitely diagnose those by looking at the paralyzed democratic systems by party divisions, and then influenced excessively by moneyed interests. Right? These are very important problems right now we face in the United States, and then perverted by the disappearance of civic virtue. This is also a very important component of many democratic systems in the Western world. So representative institutions appear unable to identify and address our most consequential public problems. So it can be the politics of distribution, income inequality, racial equity, immigration, the proper balance between liberty and national security, and it goes on and on. So basically, not anymore authoritarian or communist threats to liberal democracies, but rather we have 2 concerns that characterize current debates. The first one is there is a sense that constitutional democratic forms, procedures, and practices are softening in the face of allegedly more authentic and more efficacious types of political participation. And then there is also widespread anxiety that national borders no longer define a zone of security. So those are very important reasons of the anxiety. And finally, there is a profound crisis of moral legitimacy, practical capacity, I think this is very important, the efficiency of democracy, and the institutional sustainability. So I have more to talk about, but unfortunately it is almost 15 minutes. So I will talk more about this stuff tomorrow when we have our synchronous meeting. And I hope to see you all tomorrow in our synchronous meeting. Otherwise, have a nice day. Take care.